After the men had befriended the girls, they would invite them upstairs. This is one of the rooms where they were plied with alcohol to get them drunk.
As soon as she'd had the courage to say it, they should have reacted, and they didn't.
A 46-year-old male nurse has been arrested on suspicion of tampering with medical records.
With this hospital now a crime scene, security around drugs, but also around saline, is strict.
What we saw, we just cannot believe it.
There were people in our newsroom who were saying, there's something not right about this.
Every time we went up, it always led to something sexual, anything from kissing right through to, you know, sleeping with the person.
She was handed over to his supposed nephew simply as a birthday present.
Everything that we now know of and think of in terms of child sexual abuse followed Rochdale.
And so the girls, either too scared to refuse or given so much to drink they didn't know what they were doing, were driven across the north to have sex with queues of men.
If he wanted something, it was either yeah or it happened in a bad way. Maybe they just thought I was some stupid kid and it, you know, it just didn't mean anything.
It was an open secret in these communities that this was going on, and the authorities were doing nothing about it.
The people who should have been looking after these girls were effectively turning a blind eye to rape.
We begin with the story of a young girl from Rochdale who has asked us to call her Lily. Lily was born into a world of drink and drug abuse. By the time she was 9, she had already lost her father.
When I was growing up, it was just really hectic. A lot of it I've blocked out because of the amount of things that have happened.
Her mother became an alcoholic, and by the age of 11, Lily was placed with a foster carer.
When I was in foster care, because I didn't feel like I was wanted, I used to just go out every day and night and stay out till as late as I could.
Age 13, Lily was allowed to move back in with her mother. But due to her battle with alcoholism, her mum wasn't able to offer Lily the stability and love she was desperate for.
When I moved back with my mum, it ended up being really, really hard because she was still drinking. I just felt like I was on my own. I felt like I had to be my mum's carer.
I wasn't in the best state of mind. We had quite a lot of arguments, a lot of falling out.
Over the next few years, Lily continued to escape her home life by seeking the comfort and attention she craved in a number of encounters with older men, who offered her cigarettes and alcohol in return for sexual activity. Walking out of school one day, Lily, now 15, was approached by a 32-year-old man named Abdul Haq, also known as Sarge.
Yeah, hello, excuse me.
I met a taxi driver who pulled alongside me, said, you know, am I okay, and kind of took like a bit of an interest in me, but it also felt like he was concerned for me, which felt nice because it was that care that I wasn't receiving anywhere else. He said, oh, get in and I'll, you know, take you home. So I got in and he took me home. Then we swapped numbers. A couple of weeks after that, he rang me and he said, can I come over and see you? So I said, yeah. He took me up like an alley kind of thing near the big church in Rochdale near Town Hall. We just parked there and then like did foreplay. Every time I seen him, he used to give me fags. So he used to give me one when I got in the taxi and then he used to give me the packet to go home with. I didn't really see it at the time, but now that I'm older and looking back, it seems a bit like payment.
I think we forget that grooming meets a need. Quite often it meets the need in the young person to feel loved, that somebody cares about them, to feel like they're in a relationship. And I think how grooming typically works is once you know you've got a young person to a position of having complete trust in you, then you will manipulate the situation to make them think that they owe you something, that you're deserving of something, and make them think that it's totally normal, for example, to demand sex from them in exchange for the fact that you've given them alcohol or cigarettes or things like that.
As Lily's life grew increasingly chaotic, her mother became more and more concerned about her constantly going out at night time.
I just wanted her home, safe, and we'd just end up in that same old argument, trying to tell her she wasn't going out. And then I just used to sit there and cry and think, what can you do? It was a constant worry, but I was frightened. If I put too many boundaries in for Lily, she wouldn't want to stay with me. I was frightened to death of losing her. Who that?
It can be very difficult. It can be very difficult for parents to identify the warning signs and symptoms of abuse and exploitation and what might be normal testing and sometimes challenging behaviour by children as they develop into young people and then teenagers as well. It's a very difficult dividing line.
I started hanging around with this one Asian male and he used to take me out in his car. We had like foreplay and stuff like that. And then that's when I started getting phone calls off people I didn't know, but I weren't sure how they got my number.
Lily found herself being regularly contacted by men who would ask her to spend time with them in their flats.
Every time we went up, there was always some kind of alcohol, either vodka, gin or something like that. It always led to something sexual by the end of it. Anything from kissing right through to, you know, sleeping with the person. I felt like they was my boyfriend and that's what you do. Plus they'd bought me beer, so, you know, can't really say no.
Still just 15, Lily continued to go out at night and now found herself in what she considered to be a more serious relationship, this time with a 22-year-old man named Freddie Kendukumana.
When I first met him, he was fine. We used to talk about the future and, you know, he said he wanted kids with me and I said I wanted kids with him. And then as we got more and more into like the kind of relationship, he started becoming violent, started hitting me. One night, he tried sleeping with me and I said no. And then he didn't take no for an answer. I was scared of him because I knew he was stronger than me. And I knew that if he wanted something, it was either yes or it happened in a bad way. So it was just sometimes easier to just kind of go along with what he said.
In search of support and advice, Lily started meeting with a sexual health worker from Rochdale's crisis intervention team.
We used to chat about like sexual health and stuff, and they was the only people that I was ever consistent in my life. They was the only people that never judged me. She used to say, you know, if you got a boyfriend, are you still seeing this person? And then I said, you know, I've got this boyfriend called Freddie. And then I told her what had happened that night and kind of explained to her what had gone on. And then she was like, well, that's rape. And I said, no, it's not. She said, it is. I knew what rape was, but with me and him, it couldn't be because he was my boyfriend. So that's why he did what he did. That was what I would, you know, was in my own head. So I thought about it and then I was like, well, it must be, you know, and then it kind of clicked.
In November 2008, 15-year-old Lily was taken to see a Rochdale police officer so that she could give a statement about the abuse she had suffered from Freddie Kendukumana.
When I first reported the thing with Freddie, it was a male police officer and he was kind of like sighing and had his head in his hands and just looked really disinterested. After I did the interview, the contact just dwindled away to nothing. I just felt like maybe I was overreacting, you know, maybe they just thought I was just some stupid kid and it, you know, it didn't mean anything.
I can't imagine anything worse as a victim of abuse than finally realising you're being abused, plucking up the courage to tell somebody that you've been abused and then nothing being done and you're being abandoned to your abuser. I can't imagine a situation that leaves you more terrified and more vulnerable.
Police were basically dismissive of victims, that these were all young girls who were vulnerable or in care, often poor families. They didn't have any social standing, they didn't know how the justice system worked. They were expendable, really, and the police's attitude was to, these girls were abused and then they were blamed for the abuse, that they were told they were making poor decisions, or these were lifestyle choices, or in some cases they were called scrubbers, or that they were prostitutes. So the victims really, the police's attitude to the victims was just to be entirely dismissive and indifferent, really.
In Rochdale, there were certainly workers out there, some professionals out there who were recognising what was happening and desperately trying to raise awareness of it. But I think within the culture of what was going on, they really were lone voices.
With a lack of interest shown from the police and social services, Lily found the pull of affection too hard to break away from. Still 15, Lily found herself in a relationship with a 23-year-old man named Rahiz Khan. But as Lily approached her 16th birthday in July 2009, she had the opportunity to take a break and consider where her life was headed.
I think with being away from everything that was going on, I had time to reflect on things. I kind of thought, oh, this isn't right, this is wrong.
However, escaping the abuse wasn't easy, and on their return, Lily and her mother were subjected to a period of terrifying intimidation.
When I'd come back from the holiday with my mum, I tried to leave Rahiz Khan and he wouldn't let me. He'd smashed my windows, he'd made threats. He said he was going to plant drugs in my house and all different kinds of things. It was really terrifying, and the longer I tried to break away, the worse it got.
Sadly, Lily wasn't the only young victim who would tell Greater Manchester Police that she had been raped. With chilling parallels, another child, known only as Girl A, made a similar allegation. Information that, had it been acted upon, could have blown apart a network of child sexual exploitation on a scale more horrifying than anyone could imagine.
As soon as she told the police what had actually happened, as soon as she'd had the courage to say it, they should have reacted, and they didn't.
In August 2008, Greater Manchester Police received a call from a takeaway shop in Rochdale.
Yes, please.
The caller stated that a young girl was causing criminal damage to the restaurant. She was arrested in the street that same night and taken in for questioning.
It's been going on for ages.
During her police interview, the 15-year-old was pressed over the motivation for the attack. She revealed some shocking information.
So he started pressuring me and forcing me to do stuff. That's what made me a sexual thing.
This young girl's nightmare should have come to an end at this point, but it was only just the beginning. Known only as Girl A for legal reasons, this child's ordeal began weeks earlier when she started visiting two local Rochdale takeaways, Tasty Bites and the Balti House.
Girl A was brought up initially on the west coast of Lancashire, but then her family moved to the Rochdale area. She went through the teenage rebellion and she went off the rails. Girl A fell into the clutches, basically, of an older girl who initially seemed to be a really good friend, and so embraced this new life of fun, drinking, staying out late at night, coming back whenever she felt like it, and was effectively lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that her friend would look after her. But on one particular day, the suggestion was, we will go to a takeaway, we can get some free food, which they'd done before, and actually it was a complete betrayal and that she was being groomed.
A worker in one of the takeaways 55-year-old Shabir Ahmed appeared to offer a warm and comforting refuge for girl A and her friends during their numerous visits, giving free food, alcohol and cigarettes to the girls. This went on for several weeks, until things took a sinister turn.
On this particular afternoon, Shabir Ahmed, he said that he just wanted a chat. He starts talking to her about, I've given you things, now it's time for me to have something. And then ushers her upstairs. She was reluctant, but felt that she had no option but to go up. Bear in mind, she's very much a child. He's in his 50s, and suddenly she realizes it's payback time. They go into a bedroom. There's no actual bed, it's just a bare mattress. He just pushes her down and just summarily rapes her. Afterwards, she's in floods of tears, she's bereft, and what he says to her is something that ultimately is horrendous. He says, "Don't cry, I love you." What is a girl of 14 supposed to make of that?
After the men had befriended the girls, they would invite them upstairs. This is one of the rooms where they were plied with alcohol to get them drunk. And this is one of the rooms where they were sexually exploited. For some of the girls, it became a way of life.
Very often the girls would be taken to these dingy, squalid rooms where there'd be multiple men and they'd have to have sex with multiple men. Very often they'd be incapacitated with drugs or alcohol. They'd be completely out of it. One girl had to have sex with 20 men in one night.
Horrifyingly, with barely any time to recover from the attack, this young girl was taken by Shabir Ahmed to a different location, where she is then raped by another man that very same night. Unable to escape, girl A soon found herself trapped in a dark network of abusers.
Very early on in the abuse of girl A, she was handed over by Shabir Ahmed to his supposed nephew, Kabir Hassan, simply as a birthday present. I mean, it just beggars belief that a human being can be passed over in that way.
A few weeks later, on the 6th of August 2008, upset and angry, girl A lost control and started attacking the Balti house in retaliation for the abuse she had suffered.
She snapped, wasn't going to take any more. The call had been made to the police by Kabir Hassan, and within a very short time was arrested for criminal damage. She was the villain of the piece, supposedly, but once she got in to be questioned, she suddenly told them, "I've been raped."
After documenting girl A's accusations, Greater Manchester Police spent the following 11 months investigating her serious claims. Shabir Ahmed and Kabir Hassan were arrested and interviewed, but denied the allegations. They were bailed pending further forensic results. A, meanwhile, was charged with criminal damage.
As soon as she told the police what had actually happened, as soon as she'd had the courage to say it, they should have reacted, and they didn't. Not properly, and therefore she felt betrayed. She had nowhere to go, and very rapidly fell into the clutches of an even more ruthless man in many ways, Abdul Aziz.
37-year-old Abdul Aziz was a local taxi driver and also the ringleader of an even larger grooming gang.
She got caught up in a world where if she was going to school, she would be texted or rung. Men would turn up in vehicles, off then, back to the house, out of school uniform, and off to be raped. She was trapped, and genuinely trapped. Couldn't get out, couldn't break away.
We'd get in the car and then they'd drive us, and we'd get to the place, a flat or a house, and then there'd just be different men there waiting. towards the end it was like it could be up to 5 different men in a day.
It wasn't until this young girl found herself pregnant and no longer wanted by the perpetrator that she was able to escape from this horrific web of cruelty.
The abuse that girl A suffered started in August 2008, but was over by the end of that year. But she'd gone through 4 months of hell, effectively.
In July 2009, 11 months on from the moment she reported being raped to police, a letter from the Crown Prosecution Service stated that on the basis of the police investigation put to them, she would not be deemed a credible witness in court. When the case was updated by a police officer, the note stated, "They do not consider there is sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction of rape, given the unreliability of C1. The investigation into girl A's claims were marked "No further action."
It's very clear that abusers in Rochdale were laughing. They were able to absolutely exploit a situation where professionals were not doing anything or not doing anything proactive to remove children from abusive situations.
I think the most shocking element is that the people who should have been looking after these girls, should have been in place to protect them, were completely failing in their duty, effectively turning a blind eye to rape.
2 girls, 2 tragic tales, and 2 sets of desperate pleas for help simply being ignored.
The state weren't interested, the police weren't interested, prosecutors weren't interested, social services weren't interested. The reversal of the decision not to prosecute was the opportunity to put everything right.
I think all too often the focus is on the behaviour of the young person and the decisions that they're making without looking at the actions of the adult who, let's face it, has deliberately targeted them.
It's a case of massive institutional failure by the police, by the justice system, by politicians and perhaps a bit by the media.
More than 2 years later, in December 2010, Greater Manchester Police formed a specialist team of officers to deal specifically with sexual abuse cases, having previously been too focused on other forms of crime.
They actually formed an operation called SPAN, which really got to grips with it. Their attitudes fundamentally changed. They really wanted to believe victims rather than not believe them, which was the default position beforehand.
The new investigative units began looking into girl A's claims, but this time in much finer detail. What they started to uncover was a complex web of victims and abusers who were often only known by their nicknames. The inquiry was further complicated by the fact that many of the victims identified were reluctant to come forward or struggled to remember the details of their abuse, having been under the influence of drink and drugs.
Once police forces up and down the country started actively looking for child sexual exploitation, what shocked them was the scale of it.
As more and more victims came to light, so did the list of perpetrators, the majority of whom were British Pakistani men and working in Rochdale's nighttime economy. One man's name in particular came to the forefront. Shabir Ahmed, nicknamed Daddy, earlier arrested and investigated in 2008, when girl A had accused him of rape, was now revealed to be a potential ringleader of a large grooming gang. But because the Crown Prosecution Service had already stated there wasn't credible evidence against him, Greater Manchester Police faced a huge sticking point. The prosecution solely relying on evidence from girl A, whose integrity had been called into question. Without being able to charge the ringleader, they wouldn't be confident in securing convictions against the other members of the gang. But in May 2011, changes were made within the CPS, and Nazir Afzal became the Chief Crown Prosecutor for the northwest of England.
I was familiar with this issue of grooming gangs up and down the country, but I had not had direct handling of one of these cases myself. I wanted to firstly understand whether there was an issue here, and secondly, whether there were any live cases that I could work on or my teams could work on. And so pretty much within the first couple of days, my colleagues brought to my attention this case that had started some years before, 2008 in fact.
The case that Nazir began to focus on was that of Girl A.
There was a very, very poor police investigation. Certainly back then, they took the view that this young girl could never be believed by a jury. So a decision that had been taken in 2009 not to prosecute Shabir Ahmed and the other man in relation to Girl A meant that potentially nobody could be prosecuted. So without reversing the decision, it would have undermined the cases against all the other men, because they could turn around to a jury and say, well, why am I here when he, alleged ringleader, is not here? It was pivotal that that decision was taken. The rest of the case, like a pack of cards, would have just fallen over.
In June 2011, Nazir Afzal made the incredibly rare decision to overturn the original ruling made by the CPS almost 2 years earlier. Greater Manchester Police were finally given the power to bring charges against 58-year-old Shabir Ahmed and 24-year-old Kabir Hassan.
The reversal of the decision not to prosecute was the opportunity to put everything right. If it hadn't been reversed, then nothing else could have happened.
And then sort of the lid came off it, and this became a sort of a scandal that was in the public eye, and it became political, and it then had to be confronted on a political level and within the police and the authorities.
With the help of the victims identified during Operation Span, including Girl A, Greater Manchester Police were now able to bring charges to 11 members of the gang. However, by the time of their arrests, the number of abuse victims was now a staggering 50 young girls, aged between 12 and 16. But the true figure is thought to be much higher.
In the Rochdale case, there were dozens of victims, but when it came to trial, it was reduced to the few that we know about. One of those was a girl of 13 who had convinced herself that she was in love with a 42-year-old taxi driver. What was love for her was simply a passport for abuse for him. She actually became pregnant, and there was another girl who was taken to a flat, and maybe 20 men would be queuing to have their turn with her.
And so the girls, either too scared to refuse or given so much to drink they didn't know what they were doing, were driven across the north to have sex with queues of men. Among many shocking facts, how long it all continued.
In February 2012, the trial began at Liverpool Crown Court, with Girl A as a key witness. Ringleader Shabir Ahmed made a memorable impression in court.
Shabir Ahmed was notorious for being a showman, being incredibly arrogant. He would glare at the jurors as they came in and out.
Shabir Ahmed was desperate to make it very clear that the whole of society was to blame for the abuse. The fact that these young girls were allowed to go out in the evenings and not have stable families around them was the reason why he could abuse them. A stupid defense, but nonetheless, that's what his defense amounted to.
Despite previously being told she wouldn't make a believable witness, Girl A courageously gave evidence via a video link.
Girl A was questioned about various aspects of the case, but just remained firm, just told the truth, and she saw the results of that.
On the 8th of May, the court case came to an end. In the face of the earlier assumptions that victims would not make credible witnesses, the jury passed a unanimous guilty verdict against 9 of the 11 men on trial.
This has been a fantastic result for British justice. These victims have been through the most horrendous of crimes, and I just want to commend their bravery in relation to the ordeal they've had to go through.
Shabir Ahmed, 59, was jailed for 19 years for conspiracy, 2 counts of rape, aiding and abetting a rape, sexual assault, and a count of trafficking within the UK for sexual exploitation. He was also subsequently convicted of another charge and is now serving a 22-year prison term. Kabir Hassan, 25, was sentenced to a total of 12 years for rape and conspiracy. Taxi driver Abdul Aziz, 41, was sentenced to 9 years for conspiracy and 9 years concurrently for trafficking for sexual exploitation. In a historic moment for the British justice system, this trial saw the first successful convictions for child trafficking for sex within the UK.
This was a landmark case. The world, and certainly Britain, could see that you could actually get CSE convictions, that these gangs would be stopped.
After the trial, all hell broke loose.
Outside court, far-right groups have held rallies. Groups of white teenagers have also protested on the streets where the men abused the girls.
And the media was saying, why is this happening? Where's this coming from? How can this be happening in our streets? Even the Prime Minister was talking about it. You name it, everybody was interested.
It's not normal relations. It's wrong, and it has to be. We have to be intolerant of it and not walk on by, as happened in too many cases in the past.
They wanted to know about the ethnicity of the perpetrators and whether or not that had any impact on what had happened. It's sometimes very difficult. People are very knee-jerk, and they see street grooming and think, oh my God, that's the only place children are going to be abused. And they see Asians doing it, and they forget that actually the vast majority of sex offenders are British white males. So that, to my mind, is the danger of just profiling victims and profiling defendants. They come from all communities and from all societies.
I think as soon as the verdicts came out, the whole country was put into a state of shock. They realised that up and down the country, this was a phenomenon that had been happening, and they wanted answers. They wanted the police to answer, for Rochdale Social Services to answer for their failings.
As the country reeled from the shock of hearing these young girls' testimonies, major investigations were underway to determine how it was possible for children to have been failed so badly by the very people who should have been protecting them.
We talk about fair trials, we talk about human rights, but actually what we don't look at is somebody who has gone through unimaginable abuse and then is ripped to shreds on the witness stand.
As a result, a number of other inquiries began, including Operation Ralph and Operation Doublet, which involved 550 officers looking at similar historical cases for sexual exploitation. Investigators revealed that they had shockingly discovered a further 50 potential perpetrators in connection to their ongoing investigations.
Detectives investigating a suspected second child grooming case in Rochdale have confirmed they've arrested 9 men. Aged between 24 and 38 years old, the men have been bailed pending further inquiries.
The Rochdale case effectively opened the floodgates, and police finally got to deal properly with the issue. They looked back at cases that they should have looked at before.
The police approached me when I was 17 and said they was reinvestigating all old sexual abuse cases.
Having been assured by police that this time around her claims would be taken seriously, Lily began helping detectives with their inquiries.
The more interviews I did, the more stuff I was remembering. I don't think they realised the scale of how big it was. My mental health really deteriorated and I couldn't handle it. I had a point where I tried to commit suicide and I just didn't even want to be here anymore.
Despite the trauma caused by reliving the abuse through her police interviews, Lily bravely continued assisting with the investigations.
When the police first approached me, they said to me, there's a big possibility you'll have to give evidence. Even though I'd been shown the courtroom, it still didn't prepare me at all for what I had to go through.
Nobody can exaggerate how traumatic any trial is, and particularly when it's sex offending. You are having to talk about the most intimate things that have happened to you, and you're a child.
Lily took part in 4 separate trials in September and October 2013 and June 2014. On trial, 12 different men who had abused Lily between 2004 and 2009. Amongst these 12 men were 37-year-old Abdul Hook, the taxi driver Lily knew as Sarge, 27-year-old Freddie Kendakumana, the older man she thought of as a boyfriend but repaid her with violence and rape, and 28-year-old Rohiz Khan, a man who had sexually exploited Lily and then threatened her and her mother when she tried to escape the abuse.
When I had to give evidence, it was the worst thing I've ever done. It just felt like I was being abused all over again.
These young girls had to be subjected to daily cross-examination by several barristers on behalf of defendant upon defendant. It went on for days and days and days. It often amounted to bullying and badgering.
They tried to say I was completely bonkers and I couldn't decipher from what was real and what wasn't real, that I would go with anyone and everyone, that it was my fault and that I made my own choices. And it was just horrible. I just felt like scum, like I was nothing.
On the strength of Lily's evidence, Abdul Hook was found guilty of sexual activity with a child and was jailed for 4 years. Freddie Kendakumana was convicted of rape and sexual activity with a minor and jailed for 8.5 years. Rohis Khan was convicted of sexual activity with a minor and witness intimidation and jailed for 6.5 years. 6 of the males were acquitted and 2 other men were found guilty of sexually exploiting Lily and both received jail terms.
In a way, I've got justice for what the men did, but if I walked down the street now and I was raped, I wouldn't go to the police. Not because of the police, just because I wouldn't put myself through being re-victimised again and again and again.
After Rochdale, the law was changed. We put in place guidance for prosecutors, guidance for police officers, new support mechanisms for victims, and looked at the whole trial process itself in a way that we've never done before. It's difficult to underestimate how much has changed, which did not exist back in 2012.
There needs to be a change in culture among the police in how they viewed victims and social services. And I think politicians had to sort of grasp the nettle and start talking about this and dealing with it. And I think lots of institutions have been shamed into dealing with it.
On behalf of Greater Manchester Police, I want to apologise to all of those vulnerable children who were let down in 2004 when Greater Manchester Police did not thoroughly investigate the abhorrent offences that had been committed against them.
Greater Manchester Police apologised for failings which led to children being put back in the hands of their abusers.
The voices of the children and the experiences of the children were finally heard, and the voices of those children helped to shock us all into finally hearing it and doing something about the abuse.
It was clear that a change in attitudes and an overhaul to working practices was required to ensure the same mistakes couldn't happen again.
You should be looking at the credibility of the allegation, not the credibility of the victim. And that's a big mindset change, and people needed help in being able to understand that.
Nationally, we're seeing government recognising child sexual abuse and exploitation as a national threat alongside terrorism. And then at local level, we are seeing improvements finally in relation to better understanding, better training for frontline social workers, police officers, health workers, and their leaders as well.
We talk to hotels, we train hotel receptionists. We go into ice cream parlours and shisha bars. We go anywhere that we think young people might be a target for someone to groom them. And that's something that didn't happen 10 years ago.
Rochdale preceded Jimmy Savile, Max Clifford, Rolf Harris, all of that. Everything that we now know of and think of in terms of child sexual abuse followed Rochdale. And people tend to forget how important that was in terms of a landmark, how important it was in terms of changing the way people worked and giving victims a voice which previously had been denied.
We can never guarantee that children, young people, adults will never be harmed. All I can say is that in Rochdale, we could not be working harder at making sure that what we do is effective and to try and make this a safer place.
I think children across Greater Manchester should feel safer because it is understood that children are now sexually exploited. They're not exchanging sexual favours for goods and it's not a contract. But more importantly, I think perpetrators should be very, very, very afraid because they are no longer being given protection. They are seen as what they are, rapists and abusers of children and young people, and should be brought to justice.
For Lily, She will bear the scars of her abuse forevermore, but she is determined not to be defined by it.
Once I can get through this part of my life and I can get my life on track, I want to be remembered for things like helping people or, you know, being really good at something. I don't want to be reminded of being that vulnerable girl who couldn't defend herself. That's not what I want to be remembered by.
Many perpetrators are now in jail that wouldn't be otherwise. So there is confidence out there, but it also requires the authorities to not be complacent and to actually look out for them and look for them in the first place.
Yet years on from the convictions, the perpetrators of these heinous crimes are in the headlines once more.
All the men were convicted in 2012 and they all received jail sentences. But I think within 5 years, by 2017, 7 of the 9 were out of jail. And then we heard stories about the perpetrators being back in Rochdale. It's been through many courts and taken years, and they've appealed and appealed and appealed, but they've actually continuously lost. But they've not been deported, and the suspicion is that all 4 of them have invoked their human rights. That's the right to private life. It appears that promises were made, or at least people were led to believe that these men wouldn't be coming back to Rochdale, and yet, you know, they're there. And one victim was in Rochdale Town Centre and was walking down the street shopping and saw one of her abusers and wet herself and had to run into a shop. She was so distressed. I think it would be an understatement to say that the victims have been failed again, because they were failed the first time when the police didn't investigate properly. They were failed by the lawyers, they were failed by social services, and now, after the trial, after men have been convicted, these perpetrators are still living amongst them. So again, yeah, the victims have been failed again.
It was just something you'd never expected to see at a main hospital.
This was a murder mystery like no other.
Police admit whoever did this could still be working on the wards.
He didn't care who he harmed. He didn't care who did the harming.
Well, I didn't make it to the sink. I fell on the bed. My breathing was terrible.
It's very difficult to explain how a human being can get to that kind of level. Stepping Hill is run by an organisation called Stockport NHS Foundation Trust. It's described as a medium-sized district general hospital. It's got about 800 beds. It employs about 4,500 staff, of whom there are approximately 200 consultants, about 300 trainee doctors, and about 3,500 nurses.
Stepping Hill Hospital's one of the 4 kind of major hospitals in Greater Manchester. I think it services about 500,000 patients every year that will go through the doors there, and a lot of the patients are of the older generation, so you're talking between 75 and 80 years old, and you know there's a huge staff base there. There's about, I think, 5,000 people that work at Stepping Hill Hospital as well in terms of the staff base, so huge hospital, very busy, and obviously one of the major hospitals in Greater Manchester.
They will receive strokes, heart attacks, people who have had accidents or emergencies. In fact, anything that might need a blue light ambulance, you could end up being taken to Stepping Hill if you're a local person.
On the 27th of June 2011, 68-year-old Josephine Walsh was due to be discharged from Ward A3 of Stepping Hill Hospital after receiving treatment for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Despite appearing to be alert earlier that morning, when nurses prepared to move her to another ward, they found her slumped unconscious in a chair, suffering from a hypoglycemic attack.
The symptoms of a hypoglycemic attack, in the first instance, they can be quite mild. They can range from just feeling slightly hungry and anxious to then feeling sweaty and shaky and just feeling kind of unwell. People then may notice that their concentration is impaired, they can't think straight, they sometimes find that they're not talking properly, and then ultimately they will start to lose consciousness. Eventually they may even go into a coma, or potentially they could die.
After receiving glucose treatment for 2 apparently random hypoglycemic attacks, Josephine's condition started to improve. The incident was investigated internally, but deemed not to warrant any police involvement.
People get sick in hospital all the time. In fact, that's the reason why they're there. So nothing was thought suspicious when somebody had a hypoglycemic episode who wasn't expected to have it. However, very shortly afterwards, in one evening, 5 people had similar episodes, and then the hospital staff got extremely suspicious.
2 weeks later, on the evening of the 10th of July, 5 male patients on Ward A1 suddenly suffered from similar attacks, causing concern and confusion on the ward. Amongst the patients were 41-year-old Grant Meisel and 67-year-old Philip Jones.
I had just got over cancer and I had a leg complaint, cellulitis. I came home and packed a bag and went into hospital. I went on to Ward A1. It was a few hours before someone saw me. It was quite dark on the ward. I don't know what time they actually changed shifts. I don't know whether it was 9 o'clock, 9:30, or 10 o'clock. But I know they'd just changed the shift, and the bag with antibiotics in of mine was empty. And a nurse came and took it off. And then the other nurse came and said I had blood in me, cannula. And then within 5 seconds, I started getting really hot and sweaty. I got up to wash my face at the sink, which was only a few yards away. But I didn't make it to the sink. I fell on the bed. My breathing was terrible. Another nurse came, the staff nurse, I think she was, opening these packets of glucose and telling me to swallow it. But I'm still sweating and they're asking me questions. I knew what questions he was asking me, but I was answering them wrong. Well, it was very scary, really. I didn't know what to think, because I just thought I'd gone into hospital for antibiotics, which are supposed to make you feel better, really, not worse.
Of the 5 patients who were affected that evening on Ward A1, only Philip was diabetic, and the only one who could expect to suffer blood sugar complications, although he controlled his illness by diet rather than insulin injections. Luckily for Philip, the glucose he was administered by the quick-thinking medical staff helped him to recover.
Started coming round then, after 3 hours, so the glucose must have been working by then. My breathing was getting better and, was able to talk.
The same evening that Philip was treated by medical staff, 41-year-old Grant Meisel was admitted to Stepping Hill Hospital to have his breathing monitored. Grant had phoned his sister to say he'd taken an overdose of medication.
It was a dose of prescription medication that he'd taken too much of, and so he was not very well, needed to be monitored, but thankfully he hadn't taken a dose which was life-threatening or indeed which was likely to cause him any long-term damage.
Grant was transferred to Ward A1.
There's nothing in the records that indicate there were any concerns about him overnight, but the following morning, at about the time of the shift change, a healthcare assistant discovered him having what appeared to be a seizure.
When Grant was then examined by the medical staff, it was discovered that his blood sugar levels were life-threateningly low. He was given emergency treatment and rushed to intensive care to be placed on a ventilator.
So that's really when the alarm was raised, particularly when a number of people, as well as Grant Meisel, found themselves in the same situation.
The number that occurred on that single night really raised alarm signals.
Suspicions that something untoward was happening were realised when a nurse on ward A3 noticed that a saline ampoule she was about to administer to a patient appeared foamy rather than clear.
I received a call from the deputy medical director to tell me that they have identified a potential contaminant in a saline ampoule. When they went into the treatment room and they were picking up ampoules, they discovered that some of them were leaking some fluid that appeared to have a fruity smell, and that was clearly a contaminant.
In total, 45 ampoules were found, which had been punctured with a hypodermic syringe, 19 of which had been contaminated. All of these were ready to be administered to patients.
The whole country were concerned about whether or not, for example, is every saline drip in the whole country contaminated, because was it done at the factory rather than happening at the hospital? So hospitals around the country were looking at their saline supplies to ensure that they hadn't been contaminated.
With this concern, doctors looked carefully at the recent deaths of 3 patients. 71-year-old Arnold Lancaster, 44-year-old mother of 2, Tracy Arden, and 83-year-old Derek Weaver. In total, there were over 20 patients in 3 wards affected over a period of just 4 weeks. Staff at the hospital decided to contact Greater Manchester Police.
Because we couldn't reassure ourselves that there weren't any other contaminated bags anywhere in the hospital, we decided to remove all the stock from everywhere, replace it with new stock, and at the same time ensure that where those stocks were being stored on the wards, that the room will be locked, and that any fluids that will be required to be taken from those rooms, there will need to be 2 nurses or 2 members of staff going in together and signing for those fluids.
Greater Manchester Police were very much aware that they were dealing with a criminal matter rather than just simply a health matter. Of course, prosecutors weren't involved at that stage. This was simply about containing the situation, understanding what had happened, and trying to prevent further harm occurring. Very quickly, they identified all of the individuals that had saline drips, and so examination of the drips that they had been given found that they had been contaminated with insulin rather than just simply saline liquid. And so then we knew that we were dealing with a criminal matter.
With investigators now certain that the victims had been poisoned with insulin, Greater Manchester Police began the hugely complex task of finding the person responsible.
You had about 700 staff working on any one time. You would have had people coming in and out, including patients, and you had visitors. In a hospital of the size of Stepping Hill, there were a number of places where drips were kept, where medication was kept. All of them pretty much were insecure. It is as busy as a shopping centre, and therefore it's pretty impossible to try and identify any one person that might be responsible for anything criminal.
Although we didn't know at that point in time whether the criminal act was committed by either a member of staff or by a visitor, we didn't know, but you still feel angry that someone decided in his warped mind or had warped mind to do something so cruel and so despicable as this. You have to keep a lid in order to always present a very professional approach and attitude, but nevertheless, I think in retrospect, it was extraordinarily difficult for everyone, not only for me, but for everyone. And whether you were having an executive role or being a nurse or a doctor working in the organisation, you felt the pressure and the stress.
We had a hospital in meltdown with every non-emergency patient being turned away. We had doctors and nurses working in twos because we didn't know who was responsible for what. We had teams going up and down the hospital to try and identify where contamination had taken place.
At that point in time, we were still uncertain in terms of what we were dealing with, whether there was one perpetrator or several perpetrators and where they worked. We had a rather high senior level meeting of NHS Northwest, and it was agreed that because of the stress that staff were under, and also because we felt that we needed to control the situation much better, that medical emergencies would be diverted to neighbouring hospitals.
With this hospital now a crime scene, security around drugs, but also around saline, is strict.
The community was scared, and the hospital authorities were scared, and therefore there was a real sense of we need to get to the bottom of this as fast as possible.
Key 103 News.
We start with some breaking news. Detectives are investigating a number of deaths at Stockport's Stepping Hill Hospital. We first were alerted to the fact that there was something seriously going on at Stepping Hill Hospital when we received a police press release. A number of unexplained deaths and obviously people falling ill, and they were launching this major investigation. There was dozens of police officers. The hospital was on lockdown. You know, the security measures that were put in place in terms of people coming in and coming out. It was just something you'd never expected to see at a main hospital.
A week after they began investigating, police admit whoever did this could still be working on the wards. So your theory is that it's likely to be someone of staff?
I would suggest that they would need an understanding of what they're doing to be able to have carried out the contamination that we've found to date.
The media came in their droves, and therefore there was an even greater sense of urgency to work at some speed. A lot of pressure put on the police to identify the culprit. This led to the sorry situation where they identified Rebecca Layton, who was a nurse at the hospital, as being the perpetrator.
27-year-old Rebecca Layton worked as a staff nurse at Stepping Hill.
Through all the various work that was going on in terms of analysis of ward patterns, staffing patterns, they came to the conclusion that she was at the scene of at least one of the contaminations.
Although Rebecca Layton was not the only member of staff to have been working on the wards at the time of the poisonings, attention turned to her when detectives believed they had identified a possible motive that suggested she was angry at being passed over for promotion. Greater Manchester Police also discovered that Rebecca Layton had been stealing medication from the hospital.
This was a huge, stressful episode for everyone working for the organisation, for the NHS. And we wanted closure. And part of that closure was, have we got someone that has been accused and is going to be prosecuted? But at the same time, we were relieved because we said, well, we can now start to get back to normal.
Media attention soon shifted away from the hospital and focused on the prime suspect, who some newspapers dubbed the Angel of Death.
The media love this kind of thing. I mean, that's just the nature of the media. So they went to town on Rebecca Layton, examining her life, what might have caused her to do this, going through her family and everything else, and going to court and watching everything.
Her picture was plastered all over the media, all over the front pages, and then the headlines came with it of killer nurse in inverted commas. You know, this girl's been arrested, first of all. You know, she's been spoken to as part of the investigation. She's not been found guilty. It was literally guilty before even being tried. She made her first appearance in court, which was via video link. She was told that she'd be remanded in custody.
On the 20th of July 2011, Rebecca Layton was arrested and charged with 3 counts of causing criminal damage with intent to endanger life, along with additional charges including theft of medication.
You can imagine from her point of view, that must have been absolutely terrifying. The fear that must have been going through her mind at that point and being put in a prison with people who have killed must have been, well, it's unimaginable.
With the further analysis that took place, it was evident to me there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute Rebecca Layton, and clearly she hadn't done this. There was evidence certainly in relation to prescribed drugs, but nothing more. And so 6 weeks in or so, as soon as I had all that evidence, I decided to discontinue the case against her and free her from custody, and that was the right thing to do.
The Crown Prosecution Service announced that the case against Rebecca Layton had been discontinued and she was freed from Style Prison. Despite this, she remained suspended by Stockport NHS Foundation Trust and was eventually sacked for stealing medication.
The police were forced to say Rebecca Layton was the wrong person. We got the wrong person, and we will all openly admit that. You know, and her lawyers were saying she was made a scapegoat because a lot of the pressure was focused on the fact that you had somebody on the loose at a hospital. The public, the media, the staff, the police, they all wanted somebody to be held accountable for that.
It is a complex investigation. It will take us time to work through, but like any investigation, this is a search for the truth. And whilst we wish to prosecute those responsible and bring them to justice, we equally have to discount and eliminate people from the inquiry who are not responsible and who are dedicated medical professionals.
We went back to square one. And then we knew that we were in for a long struggle, because we knew that in order to find incriminating evidence, it was going to be very, very difficult.
It all kind of went quiet for at least 6 months. I say quiet in a sense of there were no more incidents at the hospital. They made an arrest. Suddenly everything stops at the hospital. There's no more dramas, there's no more incidents. You know, all the fingers are pointing at, you know, this girl who's in custody. And yet when we're told that she's nothing to do with it, then you think, well, who did it? And how did that person feel when suddenly somebody else is taking the flak for what they've done? The security was so tight at the hospital, and with all the extra security checks and measures that have been put in place, it was impossible for whoever was responsible to carry on with this poisoning spree.
Despite the scale of the police inquiry, months on, they were still no closer to identifying the person behind the poisonings, and every member of staff at the hospital remained a suspect.
They had hundreds and hundreds of potential suspects. We'd now isolated it to staff members on the basis of what you needed to be able to know to do what you did. But there were hundreds of staff members. And so we literally had to eliminate so that there was just one left. And that meant going through, the police phenomenally going through every chart known to man to try and identify who was where at what time.
You not only have the core members of nursing staff, which will be probably on average about 50 per ward. There may be up to about 8 doctors working on A1 and on A3, so it's quite a sizable number of staff.
When we're talking about potentially 700 people, including visitors and everybody else, I can't begin to imagine how complicated it was and how urgent it was that this was dealt with.
6 months after the poisonings began, police received news of a possible breakthrough in the investigation.
The person that was carrying out these poisonings and these sinister acts struck again, or so it seemed.
I was required to go urgently to A3. I was shown prescription charts, which are charts that we use in order to prescribe medication, and then nurses use to administer the medication. And when we looked at the medication, it was clear that some of the dosages were altered.
The person responsible had understood that no longer was it possible for the contamination of saline drips to be effected, and that would mean that particular avenue of harming people was no longer available. So the perpetrator then chose a different tack, and namely fabricating and adding things to patient records, which would mean that they would receive fatal doses of medication that clearly they didn't deserve to, or didn't receive, or shouldn't receive.
Just to give you an example, a patient was being prescribed prednisolone, 30 milligrams a day, which is a drug that we use to reduce inflammation. But the 30 was converted into an 80. Similarly, another drug that we normally use as treatment for heart attacks, the dose of 1.5 was changed to 7.5. Now, the reason why we felt that these were clearly altered intentionally is because these dosages were either too high or excessive and never used. The reason why that was so critical was because we were able to locate when that happened. So we were able to tie a certain group of staff to that event. And because it occurred during the night, the net was getting narrower and narrower.
Having whittled down the number of staff members who could have tampered with patients' notes, detectives were now able to determine whether any of these suspects could also have been behind the act of poisoning patients' saline bags the previous year.
This was a murder mystery like no other. When you've got so many suspects, 700 staff members who could capably carry out this act, we had to eliminate them one by one. We had tens of thousands of hours of CCTV, and the police, having scoured that, were able to identify who was going where, at what time, and we could see individuals that we could therefore quickly eliminate, because they were certainly nowhere near the individuals that had been given the drips or when the drips had been contaminated. But it then enabled us to focus on one man.
All of a sudden, in January, we're alerted to the fact that somebody has been arrested.
A 46-year-old male nurse has been arrested on suspicion of tampering with medical records.
On the 5th of January 2012, police arrested Filipino nurse Victorino Chua in connection with the unlawful altering of medical records. His home was searched, and he was questioned by detectives investigating the poisonings at Stepping Hill Hospital the previous summer.
In order to maintain public confidence, you had to get it right second time. And the police, having identified Chua, had similar amounts of evidence to that which was used to charge Rebecca Layton. I was spending various hours talking to Assistant Chief Constable at the Greater Manchester Police, who was trying to persuade me that they already had enough evidence. And given the complexity of this matter, given the amount of scientific evidence that was going to be necessary, I persuaded him that it was not right to charge Chua at this time. It was too early to charge him. There was so much work to do.
I was watching the television one night, the news at 6:30, and a fella came on his bike, and I recognised him. The police came, and then I said to him, he was on my ward at night, and they said, yeah, he were. So they confirmed that he was on my ward, and I knew that he was the one that had washed my camera out.
Part of the evidence against Chua was tampering with patient charts, where the amount of particular drugs they were due to receive had been tampered in hand by some individual. We had lots of bits of evidence that pointed to Chua being our prime suspect.
Victorino Chua was bailed because he was still a very significant part of the investigation. They just needed to make sure they had enough evidence to put to the Crown Prosecution Service. So the police then have this task on their hands of collating as much evidence as they can against Victorino Chua. And it was a difficult task.
Given the nature of this case, the amount of scientific evidence that needed to be examined, I had to instruct experts after expert to show that, what had happened, how it had been caused. Because one element of the defence would have been, potentially, natural causes. Your body actually does produce sugar. And insulin is produced in your body. So we had to show that what caused the harm was what he had done and not what your natural body does. And it took a long time. But I wanted to make sure that we had all of that ready. So when we were in a position to charge him, it was then quick to trial and that we could present all our evidence to the court with speed.
After the arrest of Victorino Chua, the media began looking into his background and investigating the Filipino's medical career.
It was a case which was really high profile. A decision was taken that I should go to Manila, initially for a few days, to see, what Mr. Chua's background was. When we arrived in Manila, all we knew was his name and his date of birth. He was supposedly a trained nurse, fully qualified nurse. No reason to believe there's anything sinister about his background. So we made an application to the nursing regulator to find out if he was qualified, and then made some inquiries with the police. Our inquiries revealed that he had studied at the Metropolitan Hospital Nursing College. We discovered that he had been kicked out of the college, I think in the third year. He'd failed miserably and had switched to another nursing college, the Galang, which was one of the least respected nursing institutions in Manila.
Stephen Wright's investigation into Victorino Chua led him to a former college registrar who provided him with Chua's college records.
He invited us in to his home and he found Victorino Chua's college records. He produced them and I became very, very suspicious very quickly. The fact that there seemed to have been marks seemed like someone had changed the results. I was really concerned that this could be open to abuse. These records should not have been held at that place. They should be held centrally by the regulator. Very suspicious indeed, very suspicious.
To many Filipinos, nursing is viewed as a passport out of poverty, and the lure of lucrative work overseas has led to a booming forgery industry. Although the authorities could not categorically state that Chua's documents were forged, police were so concerned about their veracity that they themselves visited Manila. Their investigations uncovered so many loopholes in the system that they eventually raised the issue with the British government. Police now wondered if the ambiguity surrounding Chua's credentials had allowed him to leave the Philippines and secure a job with a much higher income in Britain.
He came to the UK in 2002 to work in a nursing home. He became a bank nurse for the NHS in 2007, got a full-time job at Stepping Hill in 2009. But the crucial thing really was that soon after arriving in the UK, he was approved by the Nursing and Midwifery Council on the basis of showing photocopies of his alleged qualifications.
We employed Victor Chua because he had a license to practice as a nurse from the Nursing and Midwifery Council. I understand that they now have got more robust processes in order to ensure that certificates or professional qualifications, particularly of nurses coming from abroad, are coming from bona fide associations and institutions.
Back in the UK, as the investigation into Victorino Chua continued, detectives uncovered a vital piece of new evidence. A handwritten letter that revealed an insight into the mind of Chua.
It was written by Victorino Chua about himself. He talks about himself and he talks about his life and he talks about his dark thoughts. And there were certain things in that letter that suddenly kind of pieced this all together for police.
He talks about how much he was hated, how much he hated the hospital and the fellow staff that he had there and the patients, how much he felt done by, having come to this country and given his all, and this is how he was being treated. He also called himself the Angel of Death.
They called it the confession letter because he talked about being the angel of death and how he wasn't a very nice man, yet people think he was, that there was an evil about him.
In any case of crime of this nature, what you always look for is motivation. What motivated a person? Because you've got to, at the end of the day, you've got to explain to a jury who are 12 men and women who don't know anything about this case before they walk in the court. And they'll be thinking, like we all think, well, why did somebody do this? And so the why was what was missing. And this letter gave us the why.
Victorino Chua was rearrested on the 28th of March, 2014.
In relation to this perpetrator, we had what we call circumstantial evidence. It is literally like a jigsaw puzzle. Each bit on its own probably doesn't amount to much. It might be a fingerprint there, it might be a CCTV still there, it may well be some writing on a patient record there. It would be ward records that show presence at a particular time. But if you add it all together, you then have a picture that shows you that you have the perpetrator.
With the Crown Prosecution Service satisfied that Greater Manchester Police had gathered sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, Victorino Chua's trial got underway at Manchester Crown Court on the 20th of January 2015.
12 members of the public from Greater Manchester come into a courtroom and they don't know what they're dealing with. An enormous undertaking. And the evidence itself was so complicated. And, I don't know how many people know medical experts, but everything that they say had to be, in effect, translated. So we had experts commenting on experts. The defense had their experts who were trying to undermine our case and suggest that maybe this was all naturally produced or that somebody else was responsible. But we had to simplify something so complicated so that anybody on the jury would understand that what we were dealing with, regardless of how complicated all it is, we've got one person harming other people.
The prosecution believed they had a smoking gun, the so-called confession letter penned by Victorino Chua himself.
The letter was brought up in court, but as part of Victorino Chua's defence, they said that this letter was written during a counselling session, which had happened a year before any of these incidents happened at the hospital. And obviously it was, as part of the counselling session, important that he got out all his feelings and his angers and his thoughts onto paper. But the prosecution argued that these were the thoughts of an angry man with unfinished business, who meant to do harm, who wanted to do harm, who hated the world, really, and everything that was happening to him. He wasn't in a good place. If anything, the prosecution said this built the profile of the man responsible for these crimes.
What we discovered during the course of the criminal trial was that Victorino Chua was the nurse who was looking after Grant on the ward over the course of that night when he became very unwell. We know from the testimony of one of his colleagues that he was almost certainly the sole person dealing with Grant. And we discovered that he had taken a blood sugar reading from Grant without any requirement to do so by the medical staff.
That sample that was taken was by pure chance kept and frozen. And this would have been completely unknown to Victorino Chua, because as far as the staff were concerned, when they took a reading, they noted down what that reading was, and that sample was destroyed. And that was normally the case, but what they did do, just for medical purposes, every so often, they'd pick a sample and keep it in freezing. It just so happened that Grant Meisel's blood was frozen that night. That sample was sent off to an expert, and he actually managed to find this synthetic insulin in the saline solution, and he ruled that the only way that could have been in the blood was to have been put in there by somebody. Now, that was a hard-hitting piece of evidence that it went alongside the fact that when they looked at the records from that night, Victorino Chua was working that night.
On the 18th of May 2015, nearly 4 years after the first poisoning, the jury finally came to a decision.
Given what had happened with the earlier charging of Rebecca Layton, we were on tenterhooks. We obviously felt that we had presented the case, a very strong case, a very compelling case. So when the jury came back with a series of guilty verdicts, including murder, we were obviously extremely relieved.
I think when you've got a trial which involves a lot of really complex issues and a lot of medical jargon in particular, you do worry that the jury system won't work. So they'll be bamboozled by an able defence QC. I think the police were quietly confident, but it wasn't a nailed-on guilty verdict type case.
Victorino Chua was found guilty of 33 charges, including 2 counts of murder, and was jailed for life with a minimum term of 35 years.
He is a very dangerous individual, a very calculated individual. Thankfully, very, very rare. And that is why it's been good that he's been brought to justice.
We were extraordinarily relieved. I think a sense of relief and again a sense of the starting of closure behind this event, because this took the best part of 2011 and 2015. This is nearly 4 years where a huge cloud, was hanging on, not on the hospital, but on the staff. There wasn't a day where we didn't discuss the case or we had to do something related to the case.
Once Victorino Chua was found guilty, I think there was mixed emotions, really. Obviously, from the family's point of view, they had justice, but at the same time, many had lost family members and many had been through experiences that were unimaginable. But it wasn't just those that were directly affected. It was the hospital staff. It was the hours of investigative work that the police had to do.
We have those victims who received justice at the trial. What we don't know is how many other people he either harmed or attempted to harm. And there are people out there who may well have had doses of something, but they weren't fatal or they weren't anything that caused serious harm. So we will never know how many people Chua hurt.
It's very difficult to explain how a human being can get to that kind of level. Now, he's been described as a psychopath, and he must be a psychopath in order to do the things that he did.
He didn't care who he harmed. He didn't care who did the harming. He was more than happy for nurses and other doctors and other hospital staff to take the blame and to harm other people. He didn't care which patient got it. He was one of the most calculating criminals I've ever had to deal with.
I think Stepping Hill was obviously used as an example, really, in the aftermath of this case as to the standards that all hospitals should adhere to.
Stockport NHS Foundation Trust has a duty of care to its patients to ensure that they're looked after properly, and part of that duty of care is ensuring that the healthcare professionals that it employs are people who are able to undertake that job properly. Obviously, Victorino Chua was convicted of a criminal offence, but notwithstanding that, there were lots of issues about his registration, his training, and the extent to which he was looked into properly before being employed by the trust.
In response to the questions about Victorino Chua's qualifications, the Nursing and Midwifery Council issued the following statement in May 2015. We understand that Greater Manchester Police have concerns about Mr. Chua's qualifications, but we have not been shown evidence that his documents were fraudulent. When Mr. Chua joined the register in 2002, our registration process allowed applicants to provide photocopies of documentation. We recognise that this was far from ideal, and we have significantly strengthened our processes since then. We now require original documentation, and applicants must undergo a face-to-face interview and a 2-stage test of competence. In a statement following Chua's conviction, Anne Barnes, then Chief Executive of Stockport NHS Foundation Trust, which runs Stepping Hill Hospital, said, "Our storage of saline and management of prescription charts at the time of the incident was typical of those in other hospitals across the country. Whilst no hospital systems and processes can offer a complete guarantee against the actions of a determined criminal, additional measures are now in place which go beyond standard practice."
You trust people, and then all of a sudden you don't trust people because of the thing that's happened. You don't trust anybody then. I was one of the lucky ones, really, that They could have killed me, but they didn't. But I feel sorry for the ones that had died, you know. It's not fair on their family, is it, really?
How many kids are in the house, Mrs. Philpott? Where are they? 6 of them. Sorry? 6 of them.
Have you ever seen a fire? Have you heard a fire speak to you? Huh. I have. And it wouldn't let me nowhere near it.
I've actually been down to our home, and what we saw, we just cannot believe it.
There were people in our newsroom who were saying, there's something not right about this.
But it wasn't until I stood back and realised that it was just one big fix. They both looked scared.
In a cemetery a few miles from the centre of Derby lie 6 graves. Each of the headstones marks the final resting place of a family of children.
Flowers and toys to remember children killed as they slept.
The fire started, police believe, when petrol was poured through the letterbox.
The police are saying this is a potential murder investigation, with the cause of the fire yet to be confirmed.
The events that led to the children's deaths began back in May 2003, when a 19-year-old single mother called Mairead Duffy married her fiancé.
I went myself to give her away and that there. Went to a wedding, and then there was a reception held in a club on Elton Road when we came back and that there. And there was quite a few people there and that. You know, they're kind of one crowd sitting here of a family and another family sitting somewhere else kind of thing.
Jimmy's daughter had just married Mick Philpott, a man with a sinister past.
Kim Hill was his partner when he was 21 and in the army in the late 70s. She was 17. She had the temerity to send him a Dear John letter ending their relationship.
He responded by stabbing her 15 times, and when her mother tried to intervene, attacked her, seriously injuring her as well. And he went to prison for that.
He received a prison sentence of 7 years for attempted murder.
Philpott's conviction did little to change his attitude to women.
He's so egocentric. Everything he does is important in the sense that it's got to relate to him and how he feels, and he has absolutely no compunction in doing anything to hurt somebody else. We know this because he's, hurt multiple partners in the past, and he has absolutely no remorse. And because of this combination, this makes him dangerous because he has no ability to really see somebody else's perspective. And because he has no ability to see somebody else's perspective and no remorse, this is not going to stop him when he starts hurting somebody else.
Whether his new bride was aware of Philpott's history is unknown. But even on their wedding day, Mairead's father was concerned.
He seemed to be mingling around everywhere and among the women, stuff like that there. And half the time she was sitting there on her own. And he was nowhere near her. I said to him, I said, you're supposed to be with your wife today. I says, you're going around all these women, and he did quite annoy me. I was in two minds of saying I'm going to whack him one minute, but I decided not to ruin the day kind of thing, so I just kind of bit my tongue and left it at that.
Everything that Mick does really is centred on Mick. Once you understand that, you can see why he behaves the way that he does. So, bearing that in mind, then everything that he does, he has no understanding of how it impacts on other people. And even if he does understand it, then he wouldn't care.
Already a father of 5 by the time he was 40, Mick Philpott had become adept at choosing the type of women who he could manipulate.
He always seemed to go for young girls. That was vulnerable. There was always
16, 17-year-olds, all like Mairead, she'd just come out of a relationship which was abusive, so he pretended to be there for her, and then he ended up abusing her in some way anyway. So he just went for the young guns, really, that he could control.
He'd flatter them, they would be attracted to him because he gave them the attention, maybe attention they didn't have before in their life. And very quickly, he would get them on side, he'd move them in, and very soon he would start to control them.
Mick Philpott's obsessive and abusive behaviour left a trail of broken relationships in his wake.
He's also a very, very controlling man, and he will control every aspect of a partner's life. Their finances, where they work, where they live, who they see, where they go, everything about them. And he's done this on multiple occasions with different partners.
He used to do all the shopping. He'd do the food shopping. He had control of all the money. The girls didn't get no money. If they wanted something, they'd have to ask, and it was up to him whether he said yes or no to whether they got it. He sat there, but he gave the orders out, you know, to whoever cooked the tea. You wash the pots, you do this and you do that, sort of thing.
I think his extreme narcissism is also coming from a potential position of fear. He doesn't ever want to be left. He can't tolerate any rejection, and he's got a very sensitive, potentially injured sense of self. And in the course of his life, unfortunately, multiple people get hurt in order for him to operate the way he does.
Philpott met Mairead Duffy in the year 2000, and she quickly fell under his spell. The pair moved into 18 Victory Road, and whilst at first glance the relationship was a happy one, behind closed doors, it was a different story.
To a certain extent, yes, I think she was scared. She was controlled by Mick, and she didn't have a life of her own.
They were all trying to get her out and out there. Even the woman across the road was trying to get her out. She said she could get her a safe house, that she could go there with the children and she'd be safe and out there, but she wouldn't budge. She said, no, I'm stopping where I am.
She had a job working as a cleaner at one of the local hospitals, which, by all accounts, she absolutely loved. She was a happy-go-lucky person when she was at work, and then her demeanour would completely change and she'd go quiet and silent when she used to have to finish work and go and get picked up by Mick.
I can remember going round once and Mairead, she had bruises all up her face, and made out she got attacked going to the garage one night. But she never did admit it was Mick, but, you know, I assumed, and so did my husband, we thought it was a bit strange going to a garage at 2:30 in the morning. So I think she was just covering up for Mick.
In 2002, the domestic arrangements at 18 Victory Road became even stranger when Mick moved his 16-year-old mistress, Lisa Willis, into the house. She would even act as a bridesmaid to Mick and Mairead when the couple married a year later.
Both of them started families with Mick, and it got to a stage where there were 11 children living in the house.
Everybody just kind of said, well, they all seem to be getting on very well together, you know, and we all took a back foot and said, you know, as long as we can see the kids are all right, then the two women are all right, you know, let them get on with it. But we were all, you know, weird, you know. I couldn't do anything like that, and the kids would say we couldn't, kind of thing, you know, but it was something we got used to over a period of time.
My understanding is it's quite a harmonious house, although congested, because you had 11 children in there at one stage, plus 3 adults, hence Mick having a caravan outside the front of the house that he would live in and sleep in, and in his own words, alternate nights, he'd have a different woman in there, whether it was his mistress or whether it was Mairead.
These unusual living arrangements began to attract the attention of the local community, and the situation wasn't helped by Mick's seemingly insatiable appetite for publicity.
We ran a story in 2006 where Mick Philpott came to us to say that he wanted a bigger council house, At the time, he was living at 18 Victory Road, and he was living there with his wife, Mairead, their children that he had at the time, plus his mistress, and the children that he had with his mistress at the time. On the back of our story, the Nationals picked it up the following day and ran with it. One of the tabloids dubbed him Shameless Mick after the TV programme. And on the back of that, the media appearances for Mick and Mairead spiralled, really.
It was just all about Mick, wasn't it? If he wasn't the centre of attention, it wasn't really worth entertaining in his eyes. But, his kids was looked after in our eyes. He was doing the right thing by his children. Even though he was unemployed, his kids didn't want for anything. So, no one really seen, anything wrong in what Mick was doing. But the real truth is most of the ladies thought he was a pervert. The lads knew what he was, because he never really confronted any male in any aggressive shape or form, because he was a coward. He could only do it with women.
Although the adults' relationship at 18 Victory Road was unusual, there appears to be no question that life for the children living in the house was anything other than happy.
Well, those little angels, they're so well-behaved children. Saying there's so many in the house, they was just really, really well-behaved.
They was all well looked after, all fed. You could walk past and you'd see them all in the window, bouncing around the settees, or they was on the street playing football, and, there wasn't not looked after. They was always happy. They never wanted for nothing.
But in the early hours of the 11th of May, the people who lived on Victory Road were woken by an awful sight. A sight that would change their lives forever.
I looked out the window, and then I seen about a foot-high flame coming from the front door, and I just knew whose house it was straight away.
In February 2012, Philpott's mistress, Lisa Willis, decided that enough was enough.
His mistress was always the strongest one out of the pair of them, and they always said one day she will up and leave. I think she just had enough. She got older, she got wiser, and just had enough of the controlling the situation, and just chose to get out with the kids.
Willis left 18 Victory Road along with the 5 children she shared with Mick. Philpott was furious, and he wanted revenge. But he also wanted the benefits payments that he'd lost when Lisa took her children away.
He was constantly on and on about it, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and we have to do this and that to get the children back. And I think maybe he was pointing some of the blame at Mairead. If you hadn't have been here, she might have stayed, kind of thing.
Mick and Mairead Philpott, along with their 6 children, stayed at the house on Victory Road. Furious that Willis had left, Mick began legal proceedings to gain custody of their 5 children. A court hearing was set, but it was a date that neither party would attend. In the early hours of the 11th of May, the very day of the hearing, neighbours woke to a horrifying sight.
I looked out the window, and then I seen about a foot-high flame coming from the front door, and I just knew whose house it was straight away.
My brother's waking up frantically, and to me it sounded like saying it was a fire. Because I've still obviously I've got up thinking the fire was actually in our house. But when I heard him say, no, Mick's house, look out the window.
And I just seen somebody stood on the front, female, dressed, and said, where's Mick, where's the kids? In the house.
When I first seen it out the window, I was looking through sleepy eyes. I could see flames at the door. When I got over there, and it was only a matter of minutes, we were speaking like the door was ablaze, and there was smoke coming right out of the windows, So within a matter of minutes, it had just gone up like that.
Neighbours rushed to 18 Victory Road, which was now consumed by fire. They desperately tried to get into the house to rescue the 6 children who were asleep upstairs.
With that, I ran next door because there was a caravan. His caravan was obviously there blocking access. I jumped upon the caravan, straight over, and I just seen him and Mairead in the back garden, and I didn't think at the time, I just thought, oh, there's kids in there. And then when I jumped over, he says, oh, they're all in the back bedroom. And I thought to myself, you know, what? No, he weren't helping in any way. Went into the conservatory, because it was like a maze. You had a pool table one side and conservatory another side. Dogs barking here, there, smoke, alarms going off, smoke coming out, parrots squawking. But at that time, you know, I was just thinking, get in and try and help the kids. And it just didn't work. You know, the more I was going in, the more I was coming back. Have you ever seen a fire? Yeah. Have you heard a fire speak to you? No. I have. And it wouldn't let me nowhere near it. Nowhere. Just a howling and come on closer and you're dead. You wouldn't know until you smell it. It's like putting your mouth over a car exhaust and... Bearing in mind I never had no T-shirt or nothing to cover my mouth. I was going nowhere. And my heart was just beating faster and faster, thinking, come on, just push forward, push forward.
Despite the valiant attempts of neighbours, the raging inferno that engulfed 18 Victory Road would claim the lives of 6 children who'd been asleep upstairs. Jade Philpott, who was 10, John, 9, Jack, 8, Jessie, 6, and 5-year-old Jaden died at the scene. The eldest child, 13-year-old Dwayne, Mairead's son from a previous relationship, was critically injured.
2 on 1 trolley. 2 on 1 trolley. The last one, Dwayne, on the pavement for 10 minutes, and I was trying to pump life into him.
Despite the frantic activity outside the house, onlookers began to question the actions of Mick and Mairead.
I realised straight away the parents weren't doing nothing. Well, I thought to myself, why aren't you holding on to my side saying, please, my kids, my kids? I've got kids. But as sure as I'm sat here now, if he would have touched me on my shoulder once, said, my kids, please help me, I wouldn't be sat here today, brother.
It wasn't until I got off the caravan that I came onto the side of the neighbour's garden that I actually seen Mick coming out the front as I was going in the front, you know, and it was then, straight away then, that I knew, like, you know, something's wrong there, like. The way he come out that garden when I came in, he didn't look like a guy that was coughing, like he was pretending to be. The way that I seen Mairead, that was just frozen, you know, and I asked her how many kids were in the house, she said 6. I said, where? She says, all in the back bedroom. You know, there was no reaction from her.
Within an hour after it happened, me and my brother looked at each other and said, did you see what I just seen? And we'd not spoke, and I said, yeah. Is it right what we were thinking? I apologised to that boy, you know, for not being able to touch his kids in any way. I held him, and it was like holding a brick wall. And that son of a bitch destroyed my life. Destroyed it. Because that little girl was right there, near that window, and I couldn't touch her. Couldn't lay my hands on her. I'm so glad they weren't screaming. That's all. So that would have done it then.
In the confusion outside 18 Victory Road, friends and neighbours who had tried so hard to save the children began to realise there was something dreadfully wrong. Whilst they had risked their lives trying to get into the house, the children's parents had stood by and watched.
But it wasn't until I stood back and realised that it was just one big fix. They both looked scared because they knew they'd made the ultimate fuck up. If you're going to do a move like that, whether it's to get back at your ex-partner that's left you, your girlfriend, so you've not got a girlfriend and a wife no more, you get the kids out the house. Whether it's to get a bigger house, you get the kids out the house. Make them set their aunties. You know, you don't set fire to the pissing house with the kids in it thinking you can stop it. You can't. You know, he looked shocked, mate, and that's what struck me. You know, and he knew, I've known him for years, and he looked in my eyes and I knew. You know, I've got your ticket here, mate.
With the inferno finally out, police officers began to search for clues that they hoped would reveal how the fire that had killed 5 children and critically injured 1 more had started. They quickly realised that the blaze was not an accident.
The fire had started at the front door. The police confirmed that quite early on as part of their investigation. It also became quite clear that the police confirmed quite early on that the fire had been started deliberately, or that was their belief. Of course, there was a joint police and fire investigation. Once it became apparent that it had been started deliberately, the investigation went on to who could have started this. Because there were 2 arrests very early on, there was an assumption that the mistress was behind it and that it was the mistress that had been arrested.
The 2 arrests came to nothing. Philpott's mistress, Lisa Willis, and the second person were released without charge, leaving police desperate to find who had started the fire. As the rumour mill round Victory Road went into overdrive, the actions of Mick and Mairead grew increasingly bizarre, despite the eldest child, Dwayne, fighting for his life in hospital.
Dwayne was transferred to Birmingham Hospital, and at the time, Mick didn't want to go because he had a court appearance in the morning. So he said to Mairead, "You go." And then, obviously, they told him, you must go.
And near enough, literally had to be forced into the car to go to Birmingham. My youngest daughter said that her and her mammy went up at 2 o'clock, and Mairead and Mick were in with Dwayne, and she said, "You want us to take over for an hour or 2 so she can go and freshen up and get a cup of tea and that there." They never came back till 11 o'clock that night. And my youngest daughter said you could tell them right away what they'd been doing because Mairead had all on her neck.
Unfortunately, there's been a severe deterioration in the condition of Dwayne. He's been at hospital now, obviously, since the fire. And in essence now, he's only being kept alive by a life support machine, which is very, very sad.
Dwayne Philpott lost his fight for life on the 14th of May, 3 days after the fire. As the police investigation continued, his parents seemingly had no idea that the finger of suspicion was pointing directly at them.
There was a huge amount of outpouring of grief in the community and further beyond for Mick and Mairead. They'd lost their 6 children, a house fire, who wouldn't have sympathy for them. But then during that time, they'd been put into a hotel room in the Derby Hospital where the children's bodies were taken after the fire. There were rumours starting to circulate that Mick was going to different places and asking people for money. We know that he went to the travelling community and was given thousands of pounds by them, so they'd rallied round to support him. We'd heard that he'd been to one of the local supermarkets asking for handouts, asking for clothes. There was also a rumour that he was offered some clothes by one of the local supermarkets, but then turned them down because the clothes weren't good enough for him.
You had the Sikh community, you had the Asian community, you had the Gypsy community that chucked a few thousand pounds to him that night because he'd lost his family, his ass and everything.
They'd been out shopping, they'd been down the pubs singing karaoke, they'd been down to Victory Roads to barbecues and that there.
I was upstairs at my mum's house and there was a knock on the door. My cousin answered it, actually, who was staying that night at my mum's house, saying Mick and Mairead's here. Now, this is a week after the fire, after what's all going through my head. And they come round to thank me and my brother for making the effort. Now, when they come in my mum's kitchen, there was not one bit of emotion in Mairead or one single emotion in Mick. Now, if I'd have lost 6 kids, right, there's no way that I could be standing without puffy eyes a week after, thanking someone, looking all pretty, smiling. I had to embrace Mairead. They didn't embrace me. Mick tried to fake a cry. So, it was the same thing that I seen that night.
Detectives had initially arrested Lisa Willis, but with her alibi confirmed, suspicion began to fall onto Mick and Mairead, especially now that police had proved the fire had been started inside the house. They, along with another man, Paul Mosley, a family friend who'd been at the house that night, were placed under covert surveillance, which included bugging a hotel where the Philpotts were staying.
During the time that they were in the hotel, the police made some undercover recordings of them, which were used as key evidence in the trial. They included Mairead having sex with Paul Mosley in the hotel room while Mick was there, and they also include a lot of whispered conversations, which were analysed by prosecution and defence experts.
What did you say? Tell me what you said to them. What you said about how many times I went up ladders?
I can't lost count how many times I went up the ladders.
What did you say about me trying to go in?
You tried everything you could to get in there. I said to him I wanted to run through the flames.
He was heard saying things like, "Are we sticking to the story? What did you tell the police? What did you tell? How badly did you cry? Did you really cry your eyes out?"
What did you cry when you were saying it? How bad?
Not really, really bad, but I did cry.
That's hysterical.
If the Philpotts were in any way involved with the fire, they were doing little to hide their guilt.
You know, he was going around to people's houses bragging about having all this money. He was in town shopping, singing at my mate's. Oh, it's unreal. My mate's daughter got christened and he was singing karaoke, Suspicious Minds. You've got to be happy when you sing. How's he happy after 6 children dying? Going out shopping, bragging about money.
As if this wasn't bad enough, on the 16th of May, 5 days after the fire, the Philpotts themselves called a press conference at the Derby Conference Centre. For all that witnessed it, it would become a defining moment in the case.
We got there, we really didn't know what to expect. But the Philpotts were brought in, as I'm sure everyone's seen. There were the cameras flashing, dictaphones going, you could hear the journalists scribbling in their notebooks. He pretty much collapsed straight away when he started talking. He thanked people like the Butler brothers who helped him on the night to try and get the children out.
To see this community to come together like they have, it's just too overwhelming.
In hindsight, and one of the most telling things about the whole of the press conference was how he never once paid any tribute to the children. He didn't name them, he didn't mention them. It was all over in 4 minutes and 55 seconds. Mick kept putting his hands over his face and leaning forward. Mairead had her head bowed. She'd occasionally look up at Mick. And I think it's after that press conference that a few people looked at each other, and I certainly, when I got back to the newsroom where they'd been watching it live on television, there were people in our newsroom who were saying, "There's something not right about this."
And of course, the poor firemen, the police, the ambulances, the doctors, the nurses, literally everybody who tried to help save our children, they couldn't.
To me, it was a show because I couldn't see a tear. I never heard a mention of the children or find out who done this to my children. And I thought to myself, what's wrong with the man? 6 children are dead. Somebody set the house on fire. No mention of the children, no sign of a tear. And I don't think there was a tear coming out Mairead's eye either. But she just sat there with her head down, clinging on to him.
Excuse me a minute.
The thing that I saw there was him being histrionic. This is a slightly separate thing to being narcissistic, and he has some traits of being histrionic as well. And what he was doing in that TV interview was he was really trying to show some emotion. And because he finds that hard, he gets it a little bit wrong. And so what he does is he overdoes it. So then he sort of comes out with all of the tears and all of the histrionic sort of element to him, because he thinks that's what people expect. But if you look very, very carefully at him when he's doing that, there are no tears at all. So he's wiping tears away, but he forgets that when you cry, your tears go down the inside of your nose and you have to wipe your nose as well. He's not quite worked that out, and so he wipes his eyes but forgets to wipe his nose.
What Philpott didn't realise was that as he revelled in the media spotlight, he was also being studied by the police. because at the time of the press conference, he was their prime suspect.
It was a knock on the door at my mum's house, and it was just a routine, did you see it that night? And I said to that routine officer, look, me and my brother need to speak to someone, because what I seen that night was wrong. And before you know it, we had the murder squad come in to interview us, the CID. And I'm glad it happened. Yeah.
On the 29th of May, 2 weeks after the fire, detectives felt they had enough evidence. Mick and Mairead Philpott were both arrested and charged with murdering their 6 children.
I recall sitting at my desk, an email pinging from the police press office, opening it up and seeing a 55-year-old man and a 31-year-old woman have been arrested on suspicion of murder, and just standing up and shouting over to them, literally standing up and going, the Philpotts have been arrested for murder.
It weren't a shock when they got arrested. We were supposed to meet them that morning, and I'd rang, the phones were switched off, and I said to my husband, I've been arrested. You know, they've finally been arrested. Later on that day, we found out that he had been arrested and Mairead had too. And then I think it was 2 days later, we were sat watching 10 o'clock news, and then it said on there that they've both been charged. And I was just glad that they finally caught up with them.
Only days later, a third man, Paul Mosley, a friend of the couple who was present at the house on the night of the fire, was also arrested on suspicion of murder. Their charges were later downgraded to manslaughter, meaning prosecutors didn't have to prove that the 3 accused actually intended to kill the 6 children, but only that they were responsible for their deaths.
The trial took place at Nottingham Crown Court. It started on February the 11th, 2013, which ironically was a year to the day that Mick's former mistress had walked out on him with the children. The courtroom that morning was just bristling, just the whole air of anticipation. You know, here is a man and his wife and his friend who were charged with the manslaughter of 6 of their children. The second that dock opened and that the 3 of them walked in, so they're flanked by dock officers, everyone was craning their neck. Everyone wanted to see what they were wearing, what they looked like.
As the trial began, the whole sordid story of life at 18 Victory Road was laid bare.
A local radio reporter turned around to me and said, this whole story makes Shameless look like Downton Abbey. And I think it's a line that stuck with me throughout the whole of the trial. And that's very much how I view the relationship that Paul Mosley had with the Philpotts. It was seedy, there was dogging involved, there was 3-way sex, possibly more, who knows, but it was just a relationship that I couldn't possibly comprehend me having with anyone.
Their police interviews, recorded after the arrests, only served to strengthen the prosecution's case against the accused.
I think the police interviews were interesting. What the barrister for the prosecution did bring out in those interviews was the startling similarity in what Mick and Mairead said when they first observed the fire. They both said that they saw a bright orange light, and they both also said that they heard a pop. Now, what they were describing actually was the ignition of the fire. Well, they wouldn't have seen that from the other side of the room unless they set the fire. And they both described it in exactly the same terms. The barrister very rightly pointed that out and accused them of colluding with regard to their testimony, and that's absolutely right to do that. We saw some video evidence of him being interviewed. They didn't quite pick up on this, but he gave a very revealing gesture, and he said, I saw the fire across the room, and he said, I saw the fire across the room, and he gestured the fire coming up towards his face. And of course, it couldn't possibly have done that from 20, 30 foot away. He was describing the fire igniting underneath him.
But one of the most damning pieces of evidence that was brought before the court was the 999 call made by Mairead Philpott on the night of the fire.
What's your name, Mrs. Philpott. Mrs. Philpott. How many kids are in the house, Mrs. Philpott? Where are they?
6 of them.
Sorry?
6 of them.
Mairead was very, very calm in the first part of the call. That's the first thing I thought. The operator says, "Which service would you like?" And Mairead says, "All 3, please." Later on, you see Mick says, "I can't get out. I can't get out."
The fire service is away. I can't get out!
This is not a man who's desperate to get in to the house. This is a man having a panic attack who wants to get out of the situation.
I can't get out!
As the trial progressed, the true horror of what happened on the night of the fire was about to be revealed.
Someone, whether it was Mick or Paul or Mairead, had been out and bought some petrol to deliberately start a fire to make it look as though someone had poured petrol through the letterbox and then lit it. Then someone, probably Mick, was going to grab a fire extinguisher and put it out, be the hero, go to court that morning on a custody battle with his children that he had with his mistress, use that as a, "Look at me, aren't I a hero?" And it just went tragically wrong.
The fire got very quickly out of control. Mick had apparently done some DIY work inside the house. He had painted yacht varnish all the way up the woodwork, up the stairs. This is highly flammable and should not be used on interiors. So the fire went straight up the stairs. Unfortunately, that wasn't the worst of it because there was far too much petrol used to ignite the fire. So using petrol to start a fire is one thing, but using the amount of petrol, which we know was used to start this particular fire, was really just asking for trouble.
One of the key pieces of evidence that the prosecution brought before the court was the petrol residue that was found on the clothes each of the 3 defendants were wearing on the night of the fire.
3 of them had petrol on their clothing. It was a very small amount. It wasn't a huge amount. They weren't sloshed all over their jeans or anything. But what the analysts had discovered was that the same type of petrol that was used to start the fire inside the house was also found in small quantities on all 3 of their clothing.
What was the chance that all 3 people who had been together that evening, we know they'd all been together that evening, what were the chances that they had all got total additive on them? Why would they have this additive, this petrol additive on them?
The petrol evidence, coupled with testimony from witnesses, was enough for the jury. All 3 defendants were found guilty of 6 counts of manslaughter.
When the first guilty verdict was read out, I was waiting with my mobile phone ready to send it back to our web editor to stick on the web straight away. I remember sending the message, looking over at Mick. Mick's got his arms folded, he's going like that. He isn't saying anything, and he's not showing any facial emotion. When Paul Mosley's guilty verdicts were read over, he was the only one who showed any emotion. He looked over and was shaking his head. He went pale. But as soon as they were taken from the dock and the courtroom was cleared, I think that's maybe more when the emotion came out. I know one of Mairead's sisters, as she was getting led away, said something along the lines of, I knew on that morning that you had done this. And she shouted that in the courtroom before she stormed out.
For his role as the driving force in the botched arson attempt, allegedly to frame his mistress, Mick Philpott received a life sentence, with the judge describing him as a disturbingly dangerous man with no moral compass. Mairead Philpott and Paul Mosley were each sentenced to 17 years in prison. To friends and relatives, however, the sentences were unduly lenient.
Yeah, I burst out in tears. I did. There's no justification in that at all. Divide it into 6. You can't do it.
17 years after that, You know, it's had a couple of years a kid, that's not right, man. You know. But then she's got to get out living with this on her conscience. But has she got any conscience, you know? Who knows? But they've been sentenced, justice has been paid. But for me, it wasn't long enough, nowhere near long enough.
When they passed the sentence and that there, some of us were pleased and said others weren't. Others thought they should have got more. Thought they should have been done for each child individually instead of, you know, basically there were 6 child, they got 1 sentence for the whole 6 children. A lot of us thought they should have got a sentence for each child, kind of thing, you know. And there was people stood up in court and, you know, justice has been done. My daughter went and won and this, that and the other. And all he could do when he was laugh, and when he was turning to take him downstairs, putting his finger up to his family and that there, and to us lot.
I'll never get over it. I'll try and deal with it, but I'll never get over it. It's there every day in my head. Every day, 6 little babies dead on the tarmac. Nobody can help them, and their own parents did it. And I couldn't help them. Couldn't do nothing. Stand there and watch. So no, I'll never get over it. But I'll try and deal with it. That's all I can do.
Personally, I'd like to kill the man for what he's done to them children and what he's done to my daughter. Because at the end of the day, yeah, what she has done, I can't forgive her for. She's still my daughter, I still love her, but I blame him for the way she was and the way she is now and what she's done, all his doing. That's to me, I'd strangle the man tomorrow, I gave him half a chance. Well, I mean, some nights I sit back and think, what did I do wrong that she turned out the way she did? You know, I blame myself sometimes.
Starting a fire to frame someone that's got completely out of control, where 6 children aged 13 or under have died, I can't comprehend it. I really can't. Idiotic, stupid, naive, you can use whatever adjective you like, but I think you just have to remember that, you know, it's children, 6 children, they're no longer here. I really hope Derby gets over this, but I'm not sure it will. I think it will hang over the city for a long time to come. I think the outside world will look at Derby and I think it'll go, that's a city where the bloke killed his 6 kids.